energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Caroline, can I start by offering you some motivational words?
Looking around this table, I know that we have an energetic and enthusiastic team that is going to deliver for the country. So let's get to work. Thanks very much.
That was the Prime Minister chairing the first meeting of his new cabinet after yesterday's dramatic reshuffle. The fallout of that still rippling through Westminster. I don't know if how you rate that in motivational speeches, Caroline.
Look, I think it's a very difficult thing, isn't it, for the Prime Minister to look like the change.
Is David Cameron judging him from across the table? Was he thinking, well, I wouldn't have said that?
I listen, I think it's the whole point was meant to be another reset, but we've had quite a number of them. Look, I think Sunak looked a little bit nervous as ever. Must have been quite weird for David Cameron to return to number 10. And there were also obviously the new changes in cabinet there on display. I
mean, as scales of resets go, this is a proper unplug it and plug it back in again sort of change, because we've been talking about this idea that Rishi Sunak's tried on so many occasions to reset his agenda. It does seem like this time it's a bit more far-reaching. That's not been without consequence, though. We already had one letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister submitted by the former Junior Minister Andrea Jenkins. That was over Suella Braverman's sacking from the Cabinet. Does it pose a real threat to Rishi Sunak? Very difficult to tell how serious, I suppose, that I don't, at this stage.
It doesn't seem to be enormously serious, but the issue is, of course, around the right of the party. And this does seem to be now that the top officers of state are sort of quite centrist, quite pragmatic, quite old school conservatives, One Nation conservatives maybe, and that will displease the right of the party. That's the big challenge, isn't it seems?
Yeah, and a few new cast members as well to fit into that conversation around the cabinet table too. A few job changes, the likes of Steve Barclay going to Environment from the Health Brief, Victoria Atkins taking over as Health Secretary, Laura Trott brought into the cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, replacing John Glenn as well. So a few new voices among them being fit in. How the public perceives all of this should be interesting. Savanta resurfaced its polling around David Cameron after his appointment as Foreign Secretary, saying that only 24% of adults in the UK viewed him favourably compared to 45% who viewed him unfavourably. That's, of course, when he was not in frontline politics. Now he's back.
Well, what I love about the pollsters is that they've managed to keep track of David Cameron 7 years out of frontline politics. This survey was only conducted a month ago. Yeah, so they were still asking people about David Cameron. Came in handy, though, didn't it? How does also Cameron fit in with this sort of election type slogan that Sunak has, long-term decisions for a brighter future? Yeah,
of course, he takes on the job of Foreign Secretary with his own unique set of political baggage, including promising and delivering the Brexit referendum, the so-called golden era of relations with China, and his role as an advisor to the collapsed Greensill Capital. So to discuss this, we're joined by a trio of Bloomberg experts, our own enthusiastic team around the table. Our city editor, Katherine Griffiths, is here with us, Bloomberg TV anchor and long-time China correspondent Tom Mackenzie, and our UK government editor, Alex Morales as well. Alex, I want to start with you and the issue of Brexit. Of course, David Cameron called a referendum on Brexit, then campaigned against it, then resigned when it didn't go his way. How much of what happened since can be attributed to his legacy, do you think?
Well, arguably, just about everything that's happened since is his legacy, and it's sort of unfortunate for Cameron that he spent 6 years as Prime Minister and that his legacy is the sort of psychodrama that's followed in the Tory party since then in delivering Brexit. Because at the end of the day, it was a referendum he didn't really have to promise in the first place. He made the promise, I think, at Bloomberg headquarters in 2013. I won't say this office because we've moved since. But yeah, it was a pledge he didn't have to make, and he probably thought he wouldn't ever have to deliver on it because all the polling leading up to the 2015 general election didn't seem to suggest the Tories would win an outright majority, and perhaps there was an expectation that the referendum promise was one thing that would be bartered away in renewed coalition negotiations with the Liberal Democrats. But he won a surprise majority and then followed through on his referendum promise. And it's something that, you know, in his negotiations with his EU counterparts, he told them, "Don't worry, I'm a winner." He thought he could win this referendum, and he lost it and quit immediately. And everything that's followed since is largely down to that decision.
Yeah, I mean, it's staggering. It has dominated. I mean, you call it a psychodrama. It's also simply the economic impact, the societal impact it's had on the UK has been enormous. The other issue, though, around David Cameron, I want to bring Tom Mackenzie in on this, is that he also famously heralded in this golden era of relations with China. And again, that's an issue that sort of could come back around. Xi Jinping's meeting with Joe Biden this week. And the relationship of the West to China is so enormously important. But you sort of have said that we have to think about it in its time frame, don't we? Do you think that's going to be a challenging point?
I do think that it's important for the context to bring in where we were geopolitically at this time. China was not threatening to move away from its pledges around universal suffrage for the people of Hong Kong. It had made moves to build out its islands in the South China Sea, but the UK was kind of happy to turn a blind eye to that, as was, frankly, the US on some level. There was some signs that there was repression starting to happen in Xinjiang, but nothing on the scale that we've seen. You basically did not have a President Xi Jinping, who was being as assertive, as aggressive as he has been in recent times. So that context is important. The Europeans were very happy to pursue constructive relations with China. Obama was going through his Asia pivot, so to some extent the US was taking a slightly more divergent plant, was starting to make a play for a slightly more hawkish stance on China than previously. But certainly the Europeans and the UK were of the view that having a constructive relationship with China was important. And David Cameron, along with George Osborne, who was really the principal architect of the golden era, was central to that. And they wanted to be ahead of the French. They wanted to be ahead of the Germans. You had, for example, the Treasury issuing renminbi bonds in 2014. You had the opening of the investment into Hinkley nuclear power plant that was allowed to pass under Cameron Osborne.
So maybe it was of its time, essentially.
It was of its time,
Cameron's
but
attitude.
certainly the Osborne-Cameron in lockstep partnership, there was a determination for the UK to get the biggest slice of the pie that they could in terms of that UK-China relationship, and to get ahead of ahead of their European counterparts in forging that closer relationship.
Does that mean that there'll be people rubbing their hands with glee in Beijing that he's back?
I think there's a risk of overreading that. Look, the idea that David Cameron is going to come in as Foreign Secretary with iron-plated views on China that he has pulled out of his pocket from 2015, I think is slightly naive. So I think the analysis and the critique on that front is slightly overdone. But this is a former Prime Minister who worked with an investment fund around Xi Jinping's key policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, raising about $1 billion to try and align with that policy. So he has had that relationship. He was a Prime Minister who made sure that the UK was a founding member, not just a member, but a founding member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, much to the chagrin of the Americans at the time and to some political fallout with the Obama administration. And then again, importantly, out of office, he had these relationships. So it's not inconsequential, but I do think that David Cameron, if you look back at his political history, is probably supple enough as a politician to adjust to the here and now of policy when it comes to China and the changes that have come into effect after Sunak said that era was naive and described it as naive.
Yeah, and maybe it's even a foreign policy issue that is further down the list in terms of the enormous challenges that the world faces at the moment for the Middle East, Ukraine, and so on. But when you talk about sort of subtlety and ability, we saw a little bit of that, didn't we, with David Cameron only earlier today. He was asked about another sort of controversial point, his involvement with Greensill Capital after being appointed Foreign Secretary. Here's what he had to say on that issue. Have a listen.
Well, I think all those things were dealt with by the Treasury Select Committee. And as far as I'm concerned, that is all dealt with and in the past. And I now have one job as Britain's Foreign Secretary, as part of Rishi Sunak's team, to try and make sure this country can be as secure and as prosperous in a difficult and dangerous world.
So the issue around Greensill was an accusation of lobbying. Katherine, I want to go to you on this, our city editor, of course. I think you can probably best unpack exactly, what Cameron's involvement in Greensill Capital was, or what the controversy was all about.
Yeah, so Lex Greensill had in fact worked for David Cameron when David Cameron was Prime Minister. If everyone casts their minds back, there was it turned out there was this rather extraordinary situation where Lex Greensill had an office in Downing Street, which was a slightly strange thing. So then when Cameron so sort of abruptly left office, just 2 years later, he got this job for Lex Greensill at what was then a sort of completely unknown and strange business, supply chain finance, Greensill Capital, as an advisor. Now, David Cameron has decided to never actually just be straightforward about how much he earned in that part-time role, but it's been reported in many different places that it was about $1 million a year, which is obviously a substantial sum, one that one might imagine one might remember. And then the reason, of course, is he got into trouble was Greensill went down, and then there was an enormous focus on what that business did and its links to government. And it turned out that David Cameron had used his sort of many, phone numbers he had in his phone to text and phone up and also email all his old chums in government to say, come on, how about Greensill get some of this COVID loans money that the government was trying to distribute to support the economy. Now, the Treasury Select Committee looked into what went on and issued a report that was really quite critical of David Cameron, questioned his judgment, but there wasn't ultimately any sort of finding of absolute serious, illegal action at all. The Serious Fraud Office is still looking at Greensill and its links to Sanjeev Gupta's business, the steel business, but we don't know what's going to happen with that. I mean, I think if we're being sensible, the government has clearly looked at this risk and presumably are of the view that nothing is going to be turned up that shows that Cameron himself has done anything illegal. But I suppose, as that clip we've just listened to reflects, Cameron has not at any point really sort of expressed any sort of real regret about his actions. He's talked about it being in the past. At the time, he talked about lessons learned, but in a very general sense, and not really sort of taking any kind of proper responsibility or showing true self-reflection.
And interesting to I suppose, think about how those questions may come up again facing David Cameron in the future as well. More broadly, Katherine, with your city editor hat on, will there be people in London's financial world who'd be happy to see David Cameron back in government?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will largely be quite happy in the sense that they'll see him as a serious person who, on that sort of world stage, can conduct himself appropriately. On the whole, widely, businesses will be pleased to see a tack to the centre by Sunak. But I think what we're really seeing across the board is an increasing engagement with business, with the Labour Party. And obviously they're sort of keeping a foot in both camps. But for example, last week we saw the Labour Party being able to move ahead by getting a few really big UK financial firms to take part in an infrastructure council it's setting up. And those firms were careful to say this is non-partisan. But I think, there's ever more of a sense of firms choosing to move towards the Labour Party.
I want to return to you, Alex, if I may. We've talked a lot about Cameron and his importance in the reshuffle that Rishi Sunak undertook. How do you characterise? Is this kind of bringing in somebody with heft, with experience and so on, something that could help Rishi Sunak going into a general election, or is this a sign of desperation? I suppose that's what everybody is trying to work out.
Well, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, I guess it depends on your politics, whether you decide which way round it is. I mean, clearly Sunak thinks that it's to his advantage bringing David Cameron in. He's someone who'll sort of take over the sort of international brief and I guess allow Sunak to focus more on the domestic stuff. That's what really needs his focus if he's going to win an election next year. But you'd think part of the reasoning is that David Cameron's seen as a sort of consensual centrist, politician who could perhaps reduce some of the threat posed by the Liberal Democrats in the so-called blue wall of southern and rural seats, which the Tories might risk losing to the Lib Dems. The problem with that analysis would be that Cameron is still very much tarred with Brexit, and I think a lot of the Lib Dem Tory waverers might hold that against him when it comes to a general election.
But when it comes to the UK's relationship with the EU, things have improved since the Windsor Framework Agreement. Will David Cameron be the right person to be able to build on that?
Well, I mean, I guess if you look back to David Cameron had a pretty fractious relationship with the EU when he was Prime Minister, but a lot of that stemmed from the fact that the UK was still in the European Union, and he had this sort of large contingency on the right wing of his party who he was trying to pacify. Brexit's sort of done and dusted now. It was more or less put to rest with Sunak's Windsor Framework earlier in the year. So that baggage isn't there anymore. And you can imagine that Cameron's more serious consensual approach to things would probably work quite well in the EU. And of course, none of the people he was dealing with back 7-8 years ago are still there, unless you count Mark Rutte, who I think is slowly on his way out.
Yeah. Near the exit or on the way out, as you say as well. This, of course, is something that we're thinking about in context of the value that David Cameron could bring to those conversations as well. Tom Mackenzie, the sort of this idea that David Cameron comes back with all of the background that you've given us in his relationship with China as well, could it change the game again and a new kind of era, perhaps not golden but bronze or silver?
Well, China will be hoping that certainly his past and that experience and those connections with China and the initiatives that he pursued in office and out of office will open the door to a less frictional relationship. But in terms of what is happening on the streets of Hong Kong, that was seen as a red line for the UK government to some extent. 2019, the protests, given our historical connections to that territory, China's not walking back from its very authoritarian approaches and changes around the policy structure in Hong Kong. In terms of trade, it's worth noting that trade between the two countries, UK and China, was at about $80 billion under David Cameron. It's now at about 130 billion as of last count. So despite the fact that the political tensions have increased significantly since that quote-unquote golden era of 2015, trade flows have continued. And certainly UK businesses with exposure to the Chinese economy, with all its challenges and struggles, will hope that relationship, that trade flow continues, of course, in that direction. But it's going to be really fascinating to hear from David Cameron in his first speech about China, whenever that comes, and particularly, given that this is all happening on this week, as you said, when arguably one of the most significant summits of the year is happening between the presidents of China and the US is happening in San Francisco. It's just really, really fascinating timing. So are we going to get a new golden era? I very much doubt it, because we have to be in lockstep with the US on terms of security issues, in terms of gutting Huawei from our infrastructure, and in terms of a focus on spying and cyber activities. But maybe some thawing around the edges, and certainly trade flows suggest that in terms of that part of the relationship, that continues in what many would see as a positive direction.
Yeah, but it is one of the great strategic challenges for Britain when it comes to foreign policy, and one that David Cameron will have to take forwards. Tom, thank you so much for being with us. That is Tom Mackenzie, our longtime China correspondent, Bloomberg TV anchor, and of course alongside our city editor, Katherine Griffiths. Thank you so much for joining us, and our UK government editor, ever valuable, Alex Morales.
Now, Bloomberg has a bombshell story today about how much councils are spending to combat rising homelessness in the capital. London boroughs have paid about £300 million since 2017, buying properties outside of their local area to house people who need it. Our corporate finance czar and housing guru Neil Callanan is with us for more on this story. Neil, this is a great piece of work from yourself and Olivia Konate-Ohulu as well. Can you take us through what you found and why councils are taking these steps?
Good morning, Stephen. So we sent a Freedom of Information Act request to all 32 London boroughs and the City of London, asking for a breakdown of how much they've been spending to rehouse the homeless outside the area. And the numbers came back that it's more than 1,000 homes at a total cost of about 300 million. We haven't had a reply from one of the boroughs yet, but that in and thereabouts is the numbers that you're looking at. And really it's a sign of how desperate councils are, because the massive increase in rents in London in the last 3 years has really put pressure on services that are offered to homeless people. So a lot of the boroughs are prioritising, obviously, women and children in terms of housing priorities, and many men are being told that they need to find other accommodation themselves, which often means sleeping on the streets. So we thought this would be an interesting way into the story, and obviously it's timely given the then Home Secretary a couple of weeks ago was talking about people living on the streets as a lifestyle choice. These numbers tend to not bear that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And this in the context of the manifesto promise that Boris Johnson's government made 2019. So this is the last manifesto of this Tory government, which was a pledge to end rough sleeping also in England by 2024. And there was also a pledge in there to abolish Section 21, so no-fault evictions. And that is the background, really, isn't it, of the desperateness of councils. How bad is the homelessness problem then in London and England?
Yeah, London tends to be the epicentre of this. So London has by far the highest proportion of people, even when you adjust for population, who are homeless. There are 150,000 people in temporary accommodation. So they would be B&Bs, maybe even bed sits and so forth that the council is paying for. Half of them are children. Until earlier this year, about 10,000 people were rough sleeping in London. That number seems to have gone down, but about 2,000 of those in the last quarter were new to the streets. And really that's a reflection of the cost of living crisis and the impact that's having on people's lives. Homelessness is a very, very complicated situation. There's obviously issues with addiction in many cases, sometimes leading to homelessness, sometimes as a result of homelessness. And early intervention tends to be the best course to get the best outcomes. And so councils, when they're stretched for finance like this, are really, really going to struggle with those problems.
And it's a problem that looks like it could get worse as well. We've been talking a lot about the pressure on the rental market here in London and how much rents have gone up. At the same time, local housing allowances aren't rising.
Absolutely. And on top of that, there's speculation that the government may freeze benefits in the upcoming autumn statement. So that would effectively make people poorer as well. So there is some research out there, analysis showing that 60,000 people currently renting in the private market may become homeless in the next 5 years. They're really on the knife edge, really struggling at the moment, and things like this can be enough to tip them over. If you look at the savings rates in the UK, the number of households with less than £100 in their bank account is extraordinary, and literally one big life event can be enough to tip people into this kind of scenario and situation.
Yeah, and as you say, an immensely complex situation, and yet there has been a recent success. I mean, due to the pandemic and the difficulties of COVID, there was the Everyone In scheme that actually did bring in a lot of people that were sleeping on the streets. And, I was reading the Big Issue only this morning. They were talking about how it was almost an unimaginable triumph. So, there are efforts that work. Is this a sensible move by councils to try to buy up properties to solve this very, very difficult situation? Where are they buying?
Yeah, to go back a bit, campaigners really felt that they had solved the housing crisis, the homelessness crisis in the UK just around the time of austerity. So 2008, 2010, they felt they had gotten to the point where they had systems in place that were going to help people and help avoid these situations happening. Then, of course, we went into an age of austerity. Local authority budgets got a 40% cut in real terms over the following decade. And now, again, we're starting to see that investment in homelessness services as well. Obviously, it's very late on in the day as the economy seems to be going into a recession. But yes, it can be done, definitely. And I do think councils buying homes make sense rather than paying landlords for often substandard accommodation. Private rented accommodation tends to be the worst quality accommodation in the UK based on the English Housing Survey. And so councils buying things and controlling the outcomes can often be the best situation. Obviously, they have to buy sensibly. There's been some cases where they have bought blocks of apartments that have then had their own troubles with mould and things like that. So as long as they buy sensibly and buy well, then this is part of the solution to the crisis.
But part of the issue has been is that this has been very expensive for councils at a time when their finances are already under pressure. I mean, how much capacity do councils have to be able to spend money on this?
Not very much. It's the sad reality in that case. So almost 120 council leaders recently wrote to the government and said, look, it's so bad that some of us may go bust because of this, and we've seen a lot of councils make bad investment decisions in recent years, trying to get some money in to make up for the government cutbacks and making mistakes in investments. And when you look at this, there's an opportunity there that, again, these unexpected costs and unexpected outcomes could lead to basically bankruptcies for some of the councils.
Wow, this is such an acute issue. Housing, something also that the Labour Party have pledged to radically change if they get into government. Your piece seems to suggest that the situation is already in crisis, though, and that building houses is actually a very long-term solution to an immediate crisis.
Yeah, it is part of the solution, though. Obviously, one of the reasons why we have an acute housing crisis, not just homelessness crisis in the UK, is that the government stopped building social housing, which pushed everybody into the rental sector on low incomes. There is an opportunity if home builders are pulling back, which they are, and if we are going into a recession, instead of going for austerity, you can counter-cyclically invest in housing, keep people in jobs, get more housing for your money, because obviously the costs will go down. People will want to keep teams together. Often actually construction companies work at a loss during downturns because they want to keep teams together. And you can get significantly better outcomes in terms of the number of houses you deliver by investing in a downturn, and also keep people in jobs. That's a political decision that whoever forms the next government will have to take.
Okay, Neil Callanan, our corporate finance czar and housing guru, thank you so much for joining us with details of that story today. Well, that is it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineer was Marufa Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.